So Matt Raekelboom, did I pronounce your name correctly?
You did. I'm very impressed.
Outstanding. Very good. Matt, you've garnered an awful lot of attention on TikTok helping people deal with ADHD. Your TikTok channel is Journey to ADHD on TikTok. I wanted to bring you on the podcast to talk about this disorder and see if maybe we might be able to help some people who may be dealing with ADHD and maybe not even knowing it, perhaps. After we spoke last week, I started to wonder if maybe I suffered from ADHD after I told you I once taught myself organic chemistry in a summer working as a security guard and sitting in a little box for 8 hours. I read like 5 chemistry books in the summer, walked in and got an A in organic chemistry. So I don't know if I have ADHD. But I have said I have this power where I can focus on something for a long period of time. And again, it can be a gift and it can be a curse, depending on what we're talking about. But for people, again, like me, who I'm, again, not an authority on ADHD, what is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, better known as ADHD? I do know what it stands for, but you can speak much more in depth about it. What is this condition?
Right. So when it comes to ADHD, a lot of the things that a lot of people don't, and I talk about this in a very different way. So I want to give that full disclaimer to anybody who's listening right now. I'm not going to talk about this from a necessarily scientific standpoint, but more of a human behavior standpoint.
Mm.
ADHD is something that it severely affects the way that a lot of us have the ability to pay attention, our impulsivity, our regulation of our emotions. ADHD is something better known onto my channel as a dopamine deficiency. This is something that really, really affects our behavioral towards our concentration, our motivation, and our pleasure inside of the brain. And this is something that primarily, it's very interesting. The ADHD name, attention deficit hyper disorder, has been disproven in so many ways, shapes, and forms that it's a very, very silly name, to be honest. And many people have like jokingly renamed it. Many people have attempted to rename it. And I believe one day it will be, because first of all, the starting of it, of the attention deficit, is a very, very wrong statement towards people with ADHD, because we actually have the ability to not only obtain, but retain more information than the average human being. This is where the whole idea behind hyperfixation comes into play. And the second part to this is the hyperactivity. People with ADHD, the reason on why a lot of us go misdiagnosed or undiagnosed in general is the idea that not all of us are hyper. Impulsivity is a part of our lives, but truthfully speaking, the hyperactivity comes from the idea that being dopamine deficient, dopamine has a very, very close relation to norepinephrine or adrenaline inside of the brain. And when we get our dopamine levels up, that a lot of the times makes us a lot more hyper, a lot more motivated, a lot more emotional in those ways. So very interestingly, the attention deficit hyper disorder is it's a very strange name. But ADHD is something that, in my opinion, is what's called a regulation issue. We have trouble regulating the dopamine chemical inside of the brain, which is what causes our concentration, motivation, and pleasure to be a little bit all over the place.
Very interesting. So you don't have to be hyperactive to have ADHD then.
No, and statistically, actually, most people are not hyperactive.
Really interesting. Before there was ADHD, which again is the so-called, you kind of alluded to this where they were changing the name, before ADHD was ADD. That's how I originally encountered this, attention deficit disorder, ADD. Is there a significant difference between ADD and ADHD or not?
So very interestingly, that has been disproven for a very long time. ADD and ADHD are the exact same thing. At one point, people were diagnosing them separately for exactly what I'm bringing up right now. The people that weren't hyper just had ADD, and the people that were hyper got ADHD. And in reality, we started realizing that there are actually three symptomatic traits, or not symptomatic traits, but three different classifications of people with ADHD that we could think about, which is hyperactive, inattentive, and combined type ADHD. So those are three different types that go towards it, but ADD actually does not exist anymore. And it hasn't for, I believe, 20 to 30 years now, but most people don't know that. And I will be completely honest, I didn't know that even before this year.
Wow.
Even when I was talking about this professionally, I didn't even know that.
So nobody uses the classification ADD anymore. It's all ADHD.
nobody should be using ADD. People still do, honestly. Like, it's one of the biggest questions myself and other creators and people in this industry that get all the time. Well, what about people with ADD? All you do is talk about people with ADHD. And, we very happily say, oh, we're talking about you too.
All right, well, that's good to know. I was not aware of that. Are there any other names by which ADHD goes by?
Not nothing official. And I believe that this will change in the next little while, but at the moment nobody's looking to rename a very well-known disorder.
If you were to rename it, what would you call it?
That is a really good question.
Okay.
I honestly, I haven't looked enough into it to be able to think about it enough. Truthfully, I don't like labels. I will be completely honest. There's many different terms out there that describe mental health in general. But when we're talking about the neurodivergent brain of people with ADHD, you get terminology such as hyperfixation, or not hyperfixation, that's a bad example. To get used things like rejection sensitivity dysphoria, executive dysfunction, ADHD paralysis, all of these things that get associated with it. I find people blow up terms, and they blow up the reasoning of those terms without actually knowing the whys. So even when people say, I use a very, very decent joke online that I don't necessarily have ADHD. I just got a pretty whack brain. I'm just different. And that's all you need to know about me.
Yeah.
That's all I need to know about me is I'm different and I perceive things differently.
I would agree.
So
Yeah.
Truthfully, I can't give you an answer.
And that's fine. And I'm with you. I'm not a big fan of labeling things. I mean, we're incredibly complicated creatures, and to label somebody, puts them into a hole, and you get in a medical rabbit hole. You mentioned dopamine a minute ago. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. And when I think of dopamine, at least in the world of social media, name your poison, they get this reputation of, let's go on social media, let's keep them on there, and they keep getting their dopamine hit. I've heard this phrase over and over again. They want their likes, they want their tweets, their retweets, and and all that stuff. And again, that may be one of the ways in which they try to get us to keep going back to our social media platforms that we like the most, because we apparently get this social media hit, or excuse me, a dopamine hit. Do we see people with ADHD more likely to gravitate towards social media or video games? Because that's another way, another avenue. I sometimes hear people, they like video games so much. I've heard of stories where I've heard of people who ended up in the hospital. They played a video game so darn long, they just passed out.
It is honestly, it's the biggest argument in the world is, what are people addicted to? How are people addicted to it? And you look at somebody like Dr. Anna Lemke, who is, she's the author of a book called Dopamine Nation. And I think it's an unbelievable book that everybody should read, although most people might not, because it's just not it's not a nice conversation. It's a conversation that people, I believe, need to have. And the one thing that she talks about is, in our society, whether we're talking about social media, whether we're talking casinos, whether we're talking grocery stores, video games, the school system, everything is created to give us dopamine nowadays. It doesn't matter if we're looking at a screen or anything commercially used. The entire world is a dopamine nation. And she uses the phrase, we live in a hyper-convenient society, where everybody right now, truly, even though ADHD primarily makes us into a dopamine deficiency, most people are there. And that's because we all have so much of it surrounding us at all times. You also look at this from an opposite standpoint, alcohol, nicotine, drug use, porn addiction, all of this kind of stuff is insanely dopamine infused. It floods your brain with dopamine, which is what makes it so good. It's what makes it so amazing. And it's also why 1 in 5 people with ADHD have horrible addictive issues.
Interesting. You think marketers use the dopamine neurotransmitter to get us to buy their stuff?
100%. You look at the entire ideology of TikTok, Instagram, all of this kind of stuff. I need to hook you in the first 5 seconds or you're going to go away from me. So I'm going to use a very dopamine and hitting, hey, this is a lot of excitement that I'm about to tell you right now. And people go like, ooh, it's excitement. Tell me right now. That is, realistically speaking, that's a hit of dopamine inside of the brain.
Interesting.
Dopamine not only, so you talked about people going to the hospital for video games.
Mhm.
If I could tell you my opinion on that, it's because they found one thing that makes them feel satisfied. It's they found that one thing that gives them that structure that right now there's not enough info out there to educate people on to the whys. Everybody knows that things happen, but nobody actually knows why. And when you look at video games, this is something that's very convenient. You know, for me that can't concentrate very well and can't do a lot of things, when I tell this character to jump, it jumps. When I need to kill something, I get a little hit of, an experience point. When I get new clothing on my character, when I advance in a level, all of these things are dopamine hits that make us feel comfortable when the rest of our lives, we are being told not to do something, or that we're doing it wrong, or that we need to try harder. Well, in the video game world, this is a world where what we say goes, and it makes us feel very, very comfortable.
Mm.
Tom Bilyeu, who owns Impact Theory, he also says another amazing quote, which is, if you don't go out looking for your neurotransmitters and understanding that you need to look for your neurotransmitters, your brain will find it for you.
Mm.
And very interestingly, dopamine has the ability, it's the only chemical in your brain that has the ability to control what you're thinking about, how you're thinking about it, and your morality behind what is right or wrong towards that subject.
Wow.
Now, if I could say that last part to you, it's your morality of what is right or wrong towards that subject. A very, very scary, but I think very relevant point that I can make to you is that the study's been proven time and time again, 35% of prisoners in the United States have ADHD. This has actually been tested. It's been proven many times over. And a big reason is because dopamine can be rewarded from completion of tasks, physical strain on the body, confidence in oneself, bright, flashy lifestyles or lights or any of that kind of stuff. You put that thought process into the wrong hands, and this loosely translate into hurting somebody, stealing that thing, lying, cheating, doing any of this kind of stuff. And truthfully speaking, one more time, dopamine is your morality. It has no morality. So your brain doesn't care how it's getting dopamine, provided that it's getting it. I know I kind of dragged on that point a little bit, but just to circle back to it, if you don't go out looking for your neurotransmitters, the thing that makes you concentrate, feel motivated, and feel pleasure, then your brain's going to find it for you, and it doesn't matter where. So all of a sudden, your brain knows. My favorite example with food is, something like chicken nuggets do help create dopamine inside of the brain. Now, should we be focusing on chicken nuggets for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? No. But are chicken nuggets very satisfying to us? Yes. Right. Which is why food addiction becomes so massive amongst people with ADHD. And to go back to the video game point, that's why video games become so addictive to people that don't know any better. Because most of the time, those that have video game addictions are the ones that don't have much else in their life. They know that this is their place where they can feel satisfied, where they can feel strong, where they can feel confident and structured.
Interesting.
Very long answer. I apologize if I was drifting off.
No, that's really good. I'm curious. And I know you're not a physician, but I'm curious. Are you aware of any research that people with ADHD actually make less dopamine, or is it possibly? And again, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. Is this possibly a dopamine receptor problem, where the receptors for dopamine aren't there, or are they just not making dopamine? Do we know that?
So yes, those studies are out there. I'll tell you that I can't give you a completely accurate answer, but from what I can tell, the prefrontal cortex of somebody with ADHD is the thing that's significantly smaller than the average neurotypical type person. So because of which we do have a problem actually regulating our neurotransmitters in general, primarily dopamine, cortisol, and norepinephrine are the three things that get very, very tough for us to make. Okay. Sorry, I meant serotonin, not cortisol.
Okay. Wow, that's really interesting. So you mentioned people in prison having dopamine issues and ADHD. What is it more likely? And again, I don't know the answer to this. Is it more likely for somebody who may have ADHD to go look out to maybe be a substance abuser, nicotine, drugs, alcohol, et cetera, to get a boost?
It absolutely is. And this all stems from the same idea that, once again, this is flooding your brain with dopamine. For myself, for anybody listening that ever wants to learn more, my Instagram page talks a lot more about this story, but I had a lot of addictive issues when I was a kid. And a big reason for myself is I had no idea where to go. I knew I had ADHD. I didn't really have, there was no science to back up a lot of the things, even for myself as a 29-year-old. So my parents didn't know where to go. Even my psychologist wasn't really much help towards this kind of stuff. But all I knew is life was very inconvenient, uncomfortable for me, until some friends said, "Hey, do you want to drink?" Do you want to smoke a little bit of weed? Do you want to do any of this kind of stuff? And all of a sudden, I found out who I could become. I was a very, very high functioning alcoholic, which is something I can really dive into, that I believe that all people with ADHD are very high functioning alcoholics. On top of it, drug use became easy for me. It became so satisfying and so comfortable that why in the world would I not want to be on drugs, considering, that's what makes me normal to begin with. ADHD medication is also done with methylphenidine. And these addictive substances that help us understand our brain a little bit better, they help us realize that's the answer, is sometimes taking drugs, or sometimes when we take these things, we just feel more regular. It becomes appropriated for people with ADHD. And that's my personal opinion, but I believe it's quite true in the world.
Have you seen anything in your research that might be a cause of ADHD? I mean, is there something that pregnant women may be doing or exposing themselves to while they're pregnant that may lead to this disorder down the road? Or is it possible that maybe kids encounter some environmental toxin? Again, I'm not sure. This is coming off the top of my head as we're speaking. Do we know anything about the call? Yeah, again, I'm trying to find a mechanism behind this, and again, it's just all coming to me right now as we're talking. Do we know what the cause of ADHD is?
So there's so many theories.
Okay.
It is insane how many theories are out there. And the one thing that's actually been proven a lot more recently is that ADHD is actually hereditary.
Oh.
Most of the time, if you have ADHD, it's because one of your parents have ADHD. So I know a big time, when I was growing up in the 90s, early 2000s, one thing that I heard all the time was food coloring, specifically red food dye, causes ADHD. Too much screen time creates ADHD, which my parents related that one perfectly. Well, you play video games all the time, no wonder you have ADHD. And we always heard stuff like that. And truthfully speaking, there's no one specific spot. There's not like an ADHD hub that affects 1 in 10 people. It does. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, and based on the research that I've done, I don't think there's any conclusive evidence as to what specifically causes this. This is when I figured out that my father actually had ADHD.
Wow. And then has anybody pinned down an ADHD gene? I'm guessing not, but have they?
That part I'm not 100% sure about.
The other thing that occurred to me, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is are more boys diagnosed with ADHD than girls, or is it equally?
So that is a fantastic question. And you and I actually talked about that in the pregame a little bit. And I was really excited to answer this one. Okay. So this is a question that's going on like crazy right now, is do more boys have it than girls? And the big reason on why more men get diagnosed than women, because it really doesn't matter. It's not gender specific. But more boys do get diagnosed way earlier on in life than women do, because everybody still bases on when they should get an ADHD diagnosis based on if you're being hyperactive. For myself, I was diagnosed when I was 12 years old, and very deservingly, I was a ridiculously hyper kid that, there was not a chance I didn't have it. But what's interesting is most women get diagnosed usually a starting point of around 34 to 36 years old. Wow. And that's because women, they in today's society, we get really stigmatized behind, they have to act ladylike. It doesn't matter if they're hyper. They need to be more calm. They need to be more focused. They need to be more on alert. And the interesting question where obviously I think everyone in the world should be diagnosed if they have it. The one thing that I personally have found over working in this industry for a long time is more women have more control over their ADHD than men do. Because for me, before I had the ability to regulate my own emotions or even know what that meant, they already slapped this diagnosis on me and put a pill under my tongue. Where other people, they got to learn about more of the holistic methods behind it. I find that every woman has a coping mechanism that actually helps them a lot more than the men that were diagnosed early on in life do. That being said, that's not a true fact. That's not like any kind of statistic or anything, but that's something that I've personally seen. Right. That anybody can treat their ADHD with or without medication. And that's definitely obviously going to be another subject for us. But very interestingly, the people that get diagnosed later on in life, they have a lot more habits that help them with their ADHD than those that got diagnosed early and just told that they were wrong, so to speak.
Right. Interesting. Are there traits that a parent might look for, behaviors, if you will, that might maybe say to them, hey, maybe I want to take my kid to the doctor and get a diagnosis? Should it be something they should be looking at and maybe saying it's a red flag? Let's go and see if we get a formal diagnosis.
Absolutely. So, you can look at this from many, many different areas, but a big one for me is definitely the restlessness. And we don't necessarily mean, sitting there shaking their knee or anything like that, but you start to notice, the fidgeting, the not being able to concentrate, the consistently being overwhelmed. These are traits that really, really show signs of being deficient in the chemical of dopamine. When we don't have the thing that makes us feel concentrated, motivated, and feel pleasure, obviously, we can't really just sit there and stare at a piece of paper anymore. Other than that, you can look at things like the executive functioning skills, where a lot of people with ADHD, especially in children, they don't get what everybody else does. They can't necessarily understand the concepts of things. For me personally, I think one of my biggest traits that I could say my parents should have noticed right away, I could not for the life of me figure out how to tie my shoes. I couldn't understand the concept of over and under and all the way through. Like it did not work for me, to the point where I had to teach myself how to tie my shoes differently than everybody else. And it really messed with me, because the executive functioning skills, it's not that they're off, it's not that they're wrong, it's that they're different. And because I was only ever taught the way that everybody else was taught, it didn't make sense to me. I'd say one more area to maybe think about is the idea of being overly sensitive to rejection. Something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria is massive behind people with ADHD. And if you see your kid getting very emotionally dysregular over a very simplistic thing, sometimes that will all stem from the ideas of having ADHD. And again, stemming back to the deficiency in dopamine.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Yeah. So what is that syndrome again? The rejection syndrome. What do they call that again?
Rejection sensitivity dysphoria.
Wow, I've never heard of that.
It's very early. It's very new that a lot of people are talking about this now, because nobody ever really labeled this before. And for me personally, I think RSD is, it's a very good thing to be mindful of, but I think everybody blows it out of proportion. Okay. Which is very scary to say on a recording. But the big reason on why I say this, so RSD is actually developed. It's not actually something that is necessarily a part of ADHD, but it's developed through neurodivergent brains. So people with autism, Asperger's, OCD, all of that kind of stuff, because the studies have proven time and time again, a person who is neurodiverse, they actually hear negative comments at around a 7 times multiple to a neurotypical person. So for every time that possibly you have ever been told that you're wrong, I got told 7 times for that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong or you're stupid, but it was a stop fidgeting. No, don't do it that way. Why don't you just get out of bed? Why don't you try a little harder? Doing little things like this, by hearing negativity at such a massive multiple to the average human being, we develop something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is something that makes us either strive for perfection or failure. It's one of the two. It's never I hope I can do this. It's like I'm either doing 100% of this task, or I suck and I'm a failure and everything is awful. If somebody tells me that I'm wrong during something, I can shut down because I've just been told no too many times.
Wow.
And that's something that makes us very overly sensitive to those, even as early as adolescence.
Gee whiz, that's amazing. In America, I don't know about, you're in Canada, but it just occurred to me, here in America, drug companies directly advertise to us on television and radio. Do they do that in Canada?
I haven't heard it in a long time. I've definitely heard a couple of random advertisements, but definitely not as much as America. I know America licks their chops.
Every day, incessantly, we get advertises, ask your doctor if blah, blah, blah is right for you. And it just occurred to me, how long before we see a drug commercial for RSD? You're feeling blue, you're getting rejected. Maybe you need this drug. Yep. Anyway, you heard it here first if it ever happens, because that's a new one on me, because the drug companies are constantly coming up with new drugs, and I think they're making up terms sometimes to sell medications for conditions I've never heard of before. But that's a story for another day. Yes. But rejection syndrome, that's just, I've never heard of that. Staying on the same train of thought for a second, if somebody does take their child to a physician to say, hey, I think my kid might have ADHD, How would a doctor diagnose this, and what kind of a doctor would diagnose this? Would a general practitioner be the person to go to, or maybe we're looking at maybe a psychologist, psychiatrist, child therapist? Who would diagnose it, and how would they diagnose it?
Right. So that is definitely different per country.
Okay.
But in general, it is a clinical psychologist that has to be able to do this. And, that's a very, very big question that a lot of people are asking right now is, where do I go? What do I do? There's no like just where do I get diagnosed.com. Like it's not as simple as that. Some doctors are really stepping it up and putting out those lists online, which are fantastic. And I think this information is going to be very accessible in maybe a year or two. But for the meantime, if you just go and talk to your doctor and you say, I'm showing all of the symptoms right now, I really relate to the comments and I'd like to be diagnosed for ADHD, more than likely, no matter what doctor you go to, they will have a contact that you can contact. Let's try not to say the same word twice there, but
Yeah. My guess is this is probably not something you could diagnose in one session. I would imagine a clinical psychologist might need multiple sessions to make this determination. Yes, or is they just do it on the fly and say, yeah, you've checked all these boxes, and we'll say you have ADHD. Is that true or not true?
So for myself, going through the process when I was 12 years old, I don't really remember it as much as I probably should have. And I haven't had the pleasure of getting to work closely enough with other psychologists to find out the exact way that they do this, but it's a couple of hours. The actual testing process is a couple of hours. And what I very jokingly say this all online, but I always tell people, if you see a test online or you tell somebody to, turn around 3 times real fast and then smell your armpit, and if it smells like smoke, you have ADHD, that doesn't work. There is a clinical diagnosis and a process that goes through with this. And that is the only proven way at the moment to know for sure if you have something or not.
Very interesting. If a physician does give a child a diagnosis of ADHD, what is their normal course of action? Is it medicate? What do they normally do at that point?
So this is something that I truly personally, I pray that gets different in the world in the next little while. But medication is absolutely, it's the first line of defense, and it's the only line of defense in many people's eyes right now. When very interestingly, you look at somebody like Dr. Edward Hallowell, who is, in my opinion, the father of ADHD study. And he talks about the idea that holistic methods towards ADHD can actually treat to the same degree up to about 95% accuracy. So holistic methods are very, very possible out there in the ADHD world, and something that I'm very well known for because I am completely holistic. I don't take any ADHD medication. I did for 9 years. I decided against it once I educated myself, but right there and then right what I just said is what people need to start doing. You need to educate before you medicate. Medication is still fantastic. Just for the record, for anybody listening, I do like medication. I think it does its job, and that's what's incredibly important for us. But the big problem amongst parents and, earlier adults that are just getting diagnosed with ADHD, a big problem is they take medication and they go, "Ooh, everything's good now." And then in 6 months, they feel the same depression that they used to have. They feel the same anxiety that they used to have. And they go, "But I'm medicated. Maybe I'm just broken." And it creates that downward mental health spiral of, I took the pills and then everything worked and now it's not working again. And that's because our brain and our bodies are incredibly adaptive. And I'm sure you know a lot about that.
Yeah.
So the problem is when we don't educate ourselves properly, there's a million people online that talk about the ideas that medication is not necessarily enough. Medication is not a cure, it's an aid. And the problem is that if we still don't do holistic methods in order to help our ADHD, then medication will never be enough. And it's always going to make us feel like there's something missing. It's very, very well known that 80% of all of our neurotransmitters come from our gut health. And if we are consistently eating McDonald's and putting terrible things into our body, we will always have, executive functioning issues for that kind of stuff. And that's why I think medication should never be the first line of defense. It should absolutely be offered, but I believe that there needs to be a program in between. There needs to be something that here is a list of amazing sources where you can understand these things a little bit better. I happen to know right now, it's almost strange to say, but people like my content, people like Connor DeWolf, Katie Asaurus, like just different TikTokers is what I'm talking about right now. Doctors are primarily sending their patients to our pages because we are the ones that are explaining ADHD, and then they're saying, here's some medication on top of it. Truthfully, it's better than what was happening before because most people medicate instead of educate.
Yeah, very. It's funny. I brought you up to somebody recently I was talking to, and I said, "Yeah, I'm going to interview this guy. He's on TikTok, and he's really big into ADHD education." Someone said, and you actually said this guy's name a second ago. You got to look at Connor DeWolf's page." And I was like, I have no idea who that was. So you guys are getting known out there, and it was funny. You just said it just triggered my mind. I'm like, I have no idea who Connor DeWolf is, but he's like, yeah, you got to talk to him too. Like, okay, well, he's on the list. Very interesting. Yeah, this medication, the medications that are normally given, are they stimulants or they work through a different mechanism?
So there are a lot more organics coming out right now, but primarily the most effective medication that you can take are stimulants. Those are the ones that make a very noticeable difference in your life.
Okay, those are probably the medicines I heard of years ago of soccer moms taking medications and just focusing. And I can't, for some reason, I'm flashing back to an old episode of Desperate Housewives where they were all taking the ADV medicine and they were cleaning the house and they were hyper focused. And
yep.
I'm guessing that was it.
Yeah, well, it's borderline an epidemic amongst colleges right now, colleges and universities, where more people take ADHD medication than people with ADHD.
Yeah,
like it is so wildly. I think the statistic, I can't necessarily be quoted on this, but I believe it's something like 1 in 3 college students have taken Adderall or Concerta or Risperidol or any of that kind of stuff.
Wow, that's amazing. And for listeners, yeah, I did watch Desperate Housewives. Don't judge me. It was a good show. It was. um, so for those who are going to do a more holistic approach, you mentioned gut health a minute ago. Are there people with ADHD who may be taking probiotic supplements, and do they find those things effective? And is there any research that probiotic supplements may be effective for ADHD?
There is a lot of research in the supplement world, and there are definitely a lot of them recognized and talked about a lot. I will be completely honest, I don't have much of an opinion on it. The only supplement that I personally take is one called L-tyrosine, which is an amino acid. It goes into your stomach from, different protein fiber efficient foods. And L-tyrosine has a direct link to dopamine release inside of the brain. The only reason that I take it is because it's a completely organic thing and it's very, very simplistic. But other than that, I live a very holistic lifestyle, and I don't really like to talk about things I don't know enough research on.
No, I don't blame you one bit. I think it's a good policy to have. So, final question: can you give people some ideas, some tips to help them right now, maybe cope with their ADHD? Maybe they're listening to us, they're like, oh my God, I've never heard of that before. This is great stuff. I'm not on TikTok, but they should be, and check you out. But what are some tips that you can give them right now that maybe they could use to help improve their, again, condition? I don't want to say disorder, but I want to say condition.
Right. So my favorite thing to tell absolutely anybody that are asked about this kind of stuff is, first of all, tips might not work. And this is something I really, really want listeners to understand. Tips might not work. Okay. And the big reason for this is because due to the fact that all of us are, as far as we all know, we're all human beings. And unfortunately, due to different behavioral aspects, due to how much you exercise, what you're eating, what kind of music you listen to, what kind of lifestyle you live, where you work, if you have kids, all of these things affect our brain chemistry in a very different way. So many people, the common thing that happens to any creator's videos, any psychologist that talks about this kind of stuff, you give a tip and the amount of people that go, I've tried that, it doesn't work. The best tip that I can give is that not every tip is going to work because we are different. But the easiest way that I can explain this is there is an explanation. There's an explanation as to why you are doing the things that you're doing. And that is my favorite part about ADHD. There is, there's a saying that I will tell you, this is going to be my first time ever saying this in a recording. But one of my favorite things to say is there's nothing wrong with you. There's just something wrong with you. And once we start to understand something as simple as that, when I am feeling emotionally dysregular, a lot of the times, if I drop a spoon and I want to put my fist through the wall, it's probably not because that spoon meant a lot to me. This could be because there's something else going on in my brain. And by knowing this, or even be able to recognize something like this, I now have to be able to Google, to look through different social media platforms, wherever I need to maybe say, why am I getting so angry over nothing? because the best tip I can give is that there is a why. And that's one thing that a lot of us aren't willing to accept in life right now. We all think that we're just wrong or we're different and this is a curse. Where interestingly, it's not a curse. Once again, we don't have an attention deficit issue. We have a regulation issue. If you learn how to regulate your brain chemistry, you will have the same brain as everyone else, and with a little bit of extra benefits as well. The ADHD brain can be truly incredible, provided we take care of it. And if I can end that statement on one little random quote, the question is never, are you medicated or unmedicated? It's, are you treated or untreated? And a treated ADHD brain could have medication in it. It could just be completely holistic. It doesn't matter, but you do have to treat your brain every day or you're subject to the bad sides.
Wow. It's great final words. Matt Raekelboom, where can people find you on TikTok?
So you can take a look at my TikTok account at Journey to ADHD. You can also take a look at my business, which is also called Journey to ADHD. The handle was created before the business, but the business has got a lot more of my heart associated with it. You can go to journeytoadhd.com and see how we're helping people understand their brains a little bit better, helping them tell their journeys through ADHD and introducing them to the community of all other people that are in the same boat as them.
Fantastic. Matt, I really appreciate your time. This has been an enlightening interview. And yeah, I can't thank you enough for this. I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you.